You're listening to Upstream with Shane Morris on the Colson Center Podcast Network.
Welcome to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris. In The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, C.S. Lewis describes an insufferable boy with a name he almost deserves. Eustace Clarence Scrubb's problem wasn't just that his parents were teetotalers and vegetarians who wore a special kind of underclothes and let him use their first names. No, his problem was that he had read all the wrong sorts of books, those about exports and imports and governments and grain elevators, but none about dragons. Lewis believed, and so do I, that children need stories, and the right kinds of stories, to help them make sense of their world and grow into virtuous adults. Well, it's not that hard to see why he thought this. When God chose to reveal himself to mankind, he did so not through a list of doctrinal bullet points or a ready-made creed, but primarily through a story about a king who comes to save the world and rescue his bride from the clutches of an ancient dragon. But preparing the soil of children's imaginations for that story involves telling them other good stories, ones where the bad guys have big fangs, but the good guys have the deep magic, where things that go bump in the night get knocked on the head, where self-sacrifice and love ultimately win the day. As I raise my kids, ages 8, 6, and 4, there's one story I'll be looking to right alongside Narnia, Andrew Peterson's Wingfeather Saga, which just got a beautifully and artistically updated re-release. Today, I welcome Andrew, who hardly needs an introduction to the program, to talk about these books of his and how stories shape imaginations, both young and old. Andrew Peterson, welcome to Upstream.
Thank you so much.
Well, I heard someone ask you one time how to become a published author of fiction, and you said you really had no idea how to do it except to write and perform music for 20 years first, so the publisher will take you seriously when it comes time to pitch your book. You really took a roundabout way to writing fiction. What did that look like? How did that all happen?
Yeah, well, I love books and have always loved reading and tried writing books before I ever picked up a guitar when I was in high school, And so, of course, music just ended up being the thing that got me to Nashville, and I enjoyed it. But I remember the whole time, ever since I first got married, I would tell my wife, one of these days I'm going to write a novel. And I feel like at some point she said, you should stop just talking about it and you should just do it. But also, I was just thinking about how both the novel writing thing and the songwriting thing scratched the same creative itch for me. Like I love the way songs surprise people with the truth, and songs can sneak past people's watchful dragons, to steal C.S. Lewis's phrase there. But so can stories, And so I love that. I love the way that stories work on us. And so, I just remember thinking that it was time to start working on it. But also, part of the reason was that I could even tell when I was in my 30s that as much as I love music, the travel was going to start to wear me thin. And so I just kind of was like, what can I do that would maybe allow me to be 60 years old and not slugging a guitar through a gate area of an airport every weekend? So I was like, maybe I'll just start working on this book thing, and by the time I'm 60, maybe I'll be decent enough at it to do that instead of just music.
And you made it before 60.
Hey, yeah, very, very, very surprised and thankful.
Where did Wingfeather Saga itself begin? I've heard this saying that every author of fiction has this moment that they can point to years after the fact when their world or their story kind of burst into their minds already partly formed. Was there a moment like that for you with the Wingfeather Saga?
It wasn't quite that sudden for me, but I had really vague sense of the story or the characters, maybe more. It was really more the feeling of what I wanted the story to feel like that I had in the beginning. And then I kept getting stuck because I hadn't gone to the trouble of building the world. And so if you're writing fantasy, and in a sense, like no matter what kind of storytelling you're doing, you have to do a fair bit of quote unquote research, right? And so if it's fantasy, I can't go to the library and read histories of Aerwiar. I have to actually write the histories of Aerwiar and figure out what this world is like and what the animals are and And so the whole thing started with a map for me. It was like late one night, I got out my sketchbook from high school and started doodling and, built this continent and the rivers and the oceans and started naming them. And so by the time I was ready to actually start chapter 1, I had kind of a sense of who these characters were and what the world was like where they lived.
Plus, you have to research, what the parts of a saddle are called and what the parts of a sword are called and how all the medieval terminology and stuff, or else you just make up stuff that sounds super amateur.
Oh, that's so true. It's especially true when the characters start sailing. Because there's all this vernacular that comes with sailing and ship talk that I was like, oh man.
What is a poop deck? What is a jib? I'm reading Narnia to my kids, and as soon as we talk about the Dawn Treader's poop, they just look at me with this funny expression.
Oh yeah, it's the best. Yes.
What, Dad? Who's great on that is so I'm on the second to last book of Robert Jordan and of course Brandon Sanderson's Wheel of Time.
Yeah.
And boy, I've loved it. It's taken me almost 2 years to get through, but the terminology and just the richness of the world building there, it's got to be second only to Tolkien in terms of the richness of the cultures and everything.
Yeah, man. I gave up on the Wheel of Time in high school because I was on book 3 or 4, I think, when they were all like getting longer and longer, and they meandered so much that I remember telling my brother, I'm not going to read these until he's done because he's going to die before he finishes.
And
and then he did.
Absolutely died. People get lost in the Aiel Waste the same way people get lost in Leviticus when they try to do a read through the Bible. But you got to persevere through because it gets so much better toward the end.
I've heard that. I read the first of the Brandon Sanderson books. The what are they called?
Is it Way of Kings?
Yeah, is it The Way of Kings? Is that what it is?
I've not read that one.
I got it right here. Anyway, yeah, it was like the first like modern fantasy that I'd read that I enjoyed in a long time. Yeah, it's hard to find good fantasy.
It is hard. It's especially hard to find people who are original and aren't just mimicking Tolkien to one degree or another.
Right. Yeah, you just kind of feel like you're. I'd rather eat the real thing than.
How many times can I read about elves? Enough. What was it? Barfield who said enough blasted elves already, Tollers.
Yeah.
Well, tell us about the Wingfeather Saga itself for those who haven't read it or maybe looking at picking it up with their kids. What's the back cover blurb of your story?
Well, if I had the back cover with me, I would read it to you. It's always so hard for me to figure out how to sum it up. I don't have an elevator pitch for it. It's for children of all ages. I usually tell people 8 and up, but I've also talked to parents with younger kids than that who have read it. I've also talked to grandparents who have read it and enjoyed it. So it's kind of that kind of broad reach, I hope. But it focuses on 3 children, Janner, Kalmar, and Lily, who are living in this little town called Glipwood, and the town is overrun with the Fangs of Dang, this invading army, and which is kind of like a Nazi occupation or something, and that's all they've ever known. And their dad died in the war, so their mom's raising them along with their grandfather, and Janner, the main character, thinks that he's leading this pretty awful, boring life, and then one day he finds out that he and his siblings are at the heart of this mystery that will put them on a path into terrible danger, but will also change the nature of the world they live in.
Where'd you get the inspiration for a story with fangs and black carriages and toothy cows and all the kind of zany Hogwartsy stuff that's going on in here?
Well, I mean, I loved the Harry Potter books, and they were coming out when I started the Wingfeather books. But I loved Tolkien and Lewis, and there were several other books like that I loved reading. But there was something about realizing that. How do I put it? One of the ways that I've described the story is it's like The Princess Bride meets Lord of the Rings. So I loved The Princess Bride and the kind of whimsy about that world.
Yes.
There's a lot of whimsy, but there's also a lot of heart, right? So it's like there's this real beautiful heart beating at the heart of that movie. But then The Lord of the Rings is the world building and the big epicness of the story. So I was like, what happens if you put those two things together and you have a little bit of goofiness, a little bit of whimsy? The funny thing about Harry Potter is that Hogwarts is the most ridiculous name for a school. Yes. Dumbledore is a ridiculous name for a wizard, but like the story is so great that you just kind of forget that it's cartoony. You know what I mean?
Well, It is that way, and you first hear the name of the villain, Voldemort, and like it sounds like a skin disease. What's up with that name? I know it's French and everything, but
Sure.
as soon as you begin to read into the character, and I realize that some Christians are going to have a little bit of an issue with Harry Potter, but as soon as you read into that, you understand the characters. Those names take on vast significance. Voldemort becomes this name that strikes fear the way it does in the wizarding world, and Nag the Nameless becomes this. Although it's comical on the surface, you introduce him as a nameless evil whose name was Nag, and it's kind of these contradictions at the beginning of Dark Save Darkness, or repetitions like the title. But those things take on significance as you go, and that's part of the fun of how the story builds.
Yeah, man. I wanted it to be one of those things where by the time you got to the end of the book, it was something that utterly different than what you probably thought it was going to be,
Yeah.
And I loved, like, Nag the Nameless was a joke, when I was writing the introduction the first time.
Name.
Yeah, I was just like, that's a funny name, okay. Yeah. But then when you're doing the quote unquote research, you're like, well, I got to figure out why he's named Nag the Nameless, and so I wrote this huge backstory, and I was like, whoa, okay, that's pretty intense, and I had to sit on it until I got to book 4, which is when the reveal comes, like who he is and why he's named that. So anyway, yeah, I love that stuff. It was such a joy to nerd out for 10 years, basically.
Well, not to spoil anything, but Nag's lack of a name has significance, because the books bring us back again and again to this theme of remembering your name, of having a name, and the significance of that. Give us kind of the brief overview of why that theme is such a big deal in the Wingfeather Saga, and then to you.
Well, I mean, it really comes down to where I was spiritually when I was working on the books in the beginning. Like the idea of naming, this idea that, in Revelation, where it's like there's the white stone on which is written the new name, that whole idea is so cool to me, that God has named us and that he knows us specifically is just wonderful. It's such a relief versus the kind of defacing that the enemy of our hearts wants to do to us, to dehumanize and to deface and to strip us of our names or to rename us something that we're not. And so as a Christian, like I am beloved. If you boil it all down, I am God's beloved, and I'm a sinner. Sure, I struggle. I've got a lot of growing to do, but because of Christ, I belong to him, right? And that's an unchangeable fact. There's therefore no condemnation because I am in him. And so I have struggled for many years with the kind of like internal monologue that is really pretty demeaning and struggle with voices in my head. Like, it's amazing to me that, like, when I can be honest on stage doing a concert, and you wouldn't believe the narrative that I'm fighting while I'm singing songs about Jesus, and I'm a 4 on the Enneagram, and so that might explain part of it. Is that, like, I remember somebody saying or reading in a book about the Enneagram that, like, the 4, the romantic, like, they walk into a room and their knee-jerk assumption is that everyone in the room has an essential element that you do not. And so there's this longing to belong, right? And so and I burst into tears when I read that, because it summed up junior high all the way to I'm 46 now. Like, almost every time I walk into a room, I look around and I assume that I'm the biggest knucklehead, and everybody else is in on some secret of how to be cool that I don't have,
It's like, Andrew, what's your personality type? Inferiority complex.
Well, I mean, I don't know that it's inferior. And the irony is that like the way you self-protect whenever you have this knee-jerk reaction that everybody has the thing is that you hold yourself apart, which allows you self-protect by being aloof, which has a kind of arrogance built into it. Like, you cling to your uniqueness, And so all that to say, like, remembering that I am God's beloved, like, in Christ, I am his son in whom he is well pleased. And clinging to that truth, remembering who I am at my core because of Jesus, is like one of the central struggles of my spiritual life. And so it was easy for me to write a story about a kid who just assumed that he was a waste of space, and who didn't even know who his dad was, never felt like he fit in, was awkward, and then goes on this journey where he discovers that he is more beloved than he could have imagined.
And it really ties in with the theme of the dehumanizing that evil tries to do in your story, where people, they get dehumanized in this particular way. It's called fanging, right? They get turned into something awful, and they forget their names. They forget who they were, and they get this new dark name. But they're very weak creatures at that point. It's almost like they don't have permanence in the world because they have to constantly go back and get renewed by the spell, or else they'll just fade into complete insanity and lose their lose their personhood. I love how that harkens back to so much of Scripture, but then also themes that you find in like the Great Divorce, where the ghosts are less solid, they're less real. It's the people who know their names and know their identities. Those are the real people, the ones that are the enemies that you think are super scary and threatening and destroy your whole world. They're actually the ones who've just forgotten their names and don't really have an identity of their own. And maybe that's one of those themes that just happens as you write, or maybe it was intentional. You tell me.
It's probably a little bit of both, and I think you just summed it up better than I could.
It's sometimes that happens. I'll find that somebody will read something I've written or said, and they'll bring something brilliant out of it, and I'll just go, "Oh yeah, right. That was
sure, yeah,
that was totally what I meant." Wink, wink. Well, there was another character in the story who really reemphasizes another theme, which is self-sacrifice. That's kind of at the core of Wingfeather as well, and that's Podo Helmer, and he says that blood was shed that you three might breathe the good air of life, and if that means you have to miss out on a game of Zibsy, then so be it. Part of being a man is putting others' needs before your own. Where did Podo come from, and where did that attitude in the stories come from?
Well, the Podo is one of my favorite characters because, again, early on, I thought, wouldn't it be funny if their grandpa was a reformed pirate? And I don't mean reformed.
Oh, I see. Reformed pirate in the little r sense. I got you.
Yeah. It sounds like he's a going to a PCA pirate.
We be predestined.
So no, like a pirate. And it's easy to kind of joke about pirate culture, but pirates were terrible people, right?
Right.
And so if I'm going to write a story where Podo was a pirate,
pirates
when
are fun.
Young, yeah.
We're still the baddies.
Yeah. So Podo, again, like his backstory was like heavy. When I wrote it, I was like, oh yeah, dude's been around and he's got some serious shame and some serious guilt. And so that was one of the driving factors in his thing. But like, honestly, the self-sacrifice thing is because I didn't even know this when I was working on the books in the beginning. I didn't know it till I got to the last scene of book 4 that not that it wasn't obvious to everybody else, but it wasn't super obvious to me because I was standing too close to the painting, was that Janner's central character his character flaw was selfishness. Like the dude is just selfish. And again and again in the story, he's having to learn how to put others' needs before his own, and he doesn't want to do it. And which makes the ending what it is, and I'm trying not to spoil anything, but I think that's the deal, is that it wasn't Podo's character as much as it was Janner's character that made that a theme of the story.
Maybe this is one of my central flaws or character issues as well, because I'm infamous among my friends and coworkers for not liking one C.S. Lewis book, and that is Till We Have Faces, because I kind of think Orwell was right. But that's a long thing. You can listen to the episode I did with Andrew Lazo to get a feel for why I think that. But
I bet he took issue with you.
Oh, he took a big issue with that. But in Wingfeather, I kind of had this sense also that Janner gets shortchanged. Come on, can't this kid catch a break? All he's doing is giving of himself the whole story. And then at the end, guess what he's got to do? He's got to give of himself some more. So I love the hint that there's maybe coming through on the other side and taking the laurels he's earned after that. Of course, it's nothing but a hint, but there's hope there as well, which is
Yeah.
a big deal. It kind of reminds me of the end of The Passion of the Christ, where Mel Gibson doesn't really show much about the resurrection. He just kind of shows Jesus getting up and taking a deep breath and looking out into the sunlight. That's kind of how it was. But Janner is this thing called a Throne Warden, and self-sacrifice and protection, especially the mantra is protect, is at the heart of what it means to be a Throne Warden. Tell us about that, and then why it's such a big deal for kids to hear that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a good question. The Throne Warden thing popped into my head. When was it? I just remember imagine, once I got to know Janner and Kalmar's characters and Lily's, that sometimes there's like this, I bet TV writers do this all the time, where you build a conflict into a situation, but you have no idea how it's going to play itself out. But like early on, I was like, oh, what if it was, in this kingdom, that the oldest is not the king, the oldest is called the Throne Warden, and the second born is the king or queen. And the good news is the Throne Wardens are revered and celebrated as much as the kings are. Their role is no less important. But their real value is in their whole life is about protecting and caring for someone who is weaker than they are. And so it was like built into like the DNA of this good kingdom that I imagined, which, of course has echoes of Christianity in it, this idea that if you want to find your life, you have to lose it. And so anyway, but I knew early on that like Janner was going to be the responsible one and Kalmar was going to be the knucklehead who was going to be impulsive and take a lot of risks that he didn't need to take. And I knew that Janner would have a hard time with the idea that his little brother got the kingship and he didn't. And so I don't know, man. I just the idea popped into my head and I foresaw in a glimpse that, this is going to create all kinds of wonderful conflict and tension. I wonder what that's going to be like. And so wrote it into the story. And then, of course, as the story goes, it ends up becoming this central theme.
It's like Shasta and Corin, except the succession is reversed.
Wait, I don't even remember that part of Horse and His Boy. What is it?
So Cor and Corin, and of course Cor gets renamed Shasta because he's lost and he has to make his way back to Arkenland. But they're twin brothers that were born like moments apart.
Oh, yeah.
And so one of them's Cor is destined to get the throne. And when he's like, I'm sorry I showed up and chiseled you out of your kingdom, Corin. And Corin's like, what are you talking about? Hurrah! It's princes who have all the fun. And their father's like, yeah, alas, 'tis true. But that's kind of where you get with the Throne Warden. They're these figures of legend and fawned over by all the ladies and so forth. And you see that with Artham as well.
Yeah.
Well, another thing that figures prominently in these stories, maybe it may be the biggest deal of all, really, is music, and that's not a surprise given your background and your work. But and it's also not a surprise given the influence of Tolkien, because anyone who's ever read the backstory of Arda knows that music is literally how the place was created, and in Aerwiar, music is a big deal
and
as
Narnia.
well. Yeah, and in Narnia as well.
Yeah.
Narnia was sung into existence. So, I mean that's a beautiful concept, and one that really there's platonic overtones to it. But tell us about a little bit more about music there. Where does it figure into the story, and what does that all mean to you?
Well, I mean, it's pretty obvious, I guess. But the Lily, who's the youngest sister, she's the song maiden. So it goes Throne Warden, High King, Song Maiden is the way the birth rite goes, and so she discovers after a while that she has this like power. There's a magic in her music that she doesn't really know the rules of. She can't really control it, but music does something, and that's honestly why I got into music, is because I first encountered Jesus through the music of Rich Mullins, and I had grown up in church. I was a pastor's kid. Went to, VBS and Sunday school and church camp and did the whole thing and believed it. I was kind of fine with the idea of all these things. It felt true enough to me and it was fine. But it wasn't until I heard Rich Mullins sing about Jesus that I kind of collided with the person of Christ and with the truth that he loved me. And so I don't know what it is about music, but like it can, and I should say not just music in general, but for me, songwriting. Like a song that is 3.5 minutes long, you can go into it one way and come out on the other side completely different, right? And there's not very many art forms in the world that are quite like that. You know, we all probably know what it's like to be driving down the road and to hear a song come on the radio, and you kind of are half listening at first, and by 3 minutes later you're crying, and you know that you have encountered Sehnsucht or longing, or, you know, gotten a little glimpse of the new creation, or understood more about who you were. Like, there's just this incredible power that songs have that got me into it, right? It was like songs have always moved me. And so I was like, I want to look under the hood of songs and figure out what is making them do what they do. And so that kind of got me into songwriting in general. So I loved the idea that in these books, songs would have a literal magic to them, that they could actually, they are a way of fighting back at evil in the books in a very literal sense. And part of the thing that has kept me going in the music career is the fact that I also believe that music is a way to fight back at the darkness and to tell the truth in a way that you can't quite hear in other ways.
And it, just as music figuratively transforms us in this world, it literally transforms people in the world of Wingfeather.
Yeah,
and it does so in a way that's not entirely out of step with the way you know the maker, as you call God in the story, intended. Because really, what the bad guys are doing is misusing that power. They're
right.
They're harnessing it in a way it wasn't meant to be harnessed, and then abusing the world with that. The very foundation of the world is being broken with that. Well, this phrase, and this is the last big theme I want to draw out, that the stories are true, comes up again and again. In fact, it's on the banner of the Wingfeather website. And when I actually was at the Wilberforce weekend a couple of years ago, I got a copy of Warden of the Wolf King, and I had you personalize it for my kids, and you wrote "The stories are true" in the front. And I've been, you know, when I read it to them, when they're all at the right age, you know, they're not quite, the youngest isn't quite there, and I want it to be an altogether experience. But when I read it to them, I want to really explain what that means. You know, what is the significance of the fact that the stories are true? Mm-hmm. Unpack that for me. Help me understand what that means.
Yeah, I just think what I love about that phrase is that it means a whole lot of things. And I love the fact that little kids are probably thrown by it because they're like, wait, I'm reading a story about dragons and fangs and toothed cows. What do you mean the stories are true? And what I hope is that it forces them to kind of think deeper and talk to their parents about what truth really is, and the fact that obviously all truth is God's truth, and that it hides in fantasy novels just as much as it does in songs and daffodils and scripture, right? Scripture is obviously the most acute and like sharply focused expression of that we have in that sense. I don't know if that's the best way to put that, but this idea that it kind of harkens back to C.S. Lewis's conversion, you know, on Addison's Walk, when he was a lover of mythology and especially felt a catch in his throat when he read myths about a dying and resurrecting God, right? And that he had moved the story of Jesus into that category. Well, it's a myth just like these Balder and all these other myths. And that's when Tolkien and who was the other guy on the walk with him? Hugo Dyson, maybe?
Yeah, that sounds right.
I think that's right. They were like, yes, Jesus is most definitely one of those myths, with one giant difference. It actually happened. Like that myth happened, and it's historical and factual. And so it's like the heart of all those myths was kind of gilded with the coming truth of the person of Christ, right? And because Christ is the one that spoke the whole world into being in the first place. And so, you know, that idea that he is the true myth was enough to convince C.S. Lewis that Jesus was God, you know? So I think that's what I'm getting at, is that like a lot of times it's so easy to think of fantasy especially, but novels in general, as fancies or kind of an indulgence. But I happen to think that like stories are one of the best ways we have to understand our own lives, but also the story that God is telling with all of creation.
Well, that's the whole argument that Lewis makes, in particularly in Myth Became Fact, although he relates it in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, as well, that he was familiar as a professor, expert in literature, with all of these mythologies in world history, and they all seem to be pointing somewhere, but they all took place in some dream time netherworld that wasn't really anchored firmly in history. But then in Christianity, he encountered this figure who was firmly anchored in history, and yet seemed to fulfill all of the stories. And his logic was kind of it was almost an ontological argument of myth, where he said that if all these stories are pointing in a direction, and this actually happened in history at some point, well, then that must be the source, ultimately, of all of the stories, the reason they exist in the first place. And Andrew, what fascinates me about that is another Peterson right now is coming back into the spotlight. I guess no relation of yours, Jordan Peterson, and he just did a podcast a couple of days ago with an Eastern Orthodox blogger, and he literally lays out this same argument for why he's kind of flirting with Christianity at this point, because he's a Jungian psychologist. He picks up on archetypes in the stories and dreams of mankind, the common themes that we have that tell us about ourselves. And he says they're all pointing in one direction. They're all pointing toward this Christ figure. And I'm not sure what to do with that, because it seems like this is a historical figure, but I'm afraid of what'll happen if I accept that as true. If I really believe that God became a man, the implications of that are so staggering. I'm not sure I'm ready to take that step there. But isn't it amazing how that argument flows right into the truth of Christianity, and how stories, even stuff that is not true in the sense of factual, like a fantasy novel, can nonetheless be true in this other sense.
Man, I don't even know what you're articulate and smart, and I just can thumbs up what you're saying. That's the best I've got. But yes, I totally agree. I think that kind of truth is what I'm talking about. Is that I was just talking with somebody about how frustrating it can be to watch a movie with your kids and have to pause it and say, okay, so just so you know, the worldview is kind of crazy. This is what's going on here. That's not really true. Right, you kind of, a lot of times with our young kids, every
time my kids get so annoyed with me for this.
You're always trying to kind of point out the fallacies or whatever.
Right.
On the other hand, isn't it a blast to watch a movie and to keep your eyes peeled for the times that it is accidentally telling the truth? Right. It is so fun to watch a movie. I was just giving a talk last weekend about eucatastrophe, that Tolkien idea of the sudden joyous turn in a story. And of course, I was talking about the Battle of Helm's Deep when Gandalf appears, at sunrise in the movies, and it's this amazing example. And people are kind of nodding. But then when I was like, you want a great example of eucatastrophe? It's Avengers Endgame. At the end of the Avengers movie, when everything is reversed, and you have, at that point, I had completely forgotten about the implications of what had happened. So I'd forgotten that all of the Marvel characters were going to suddenly come back to life. And I remember crying in the theater. I was like, there it is. It's resurrection and it's eucatastrophe. There's all these wonderful truths. So it just as I'm not saying it's not important to keep our eyes peeled for the lie, because we definitely need to protect ourselves from a lie, and not believing a lie simply because it's beautifully told. Right. But keeping our eyes peeled for God's truth glimmering at the edges of all kinds of stories, because it's always there. I won't say always, it's often there.
Well, if it's a good story, it's there. And that's part of the, we were talking about the Fangs and their dependence on the magic that's built into your world in music. And the same thing is true in many ways of storytellers in our world. The only way for them to write something that's going to sell, in large part, is to tap into some of those truths and set them at the center of their story. There was this couple of years ago, I wrote this piece for it was Speculative Faith, and it was called "Why Is Harry Potter More Christian Than His Creator?" And it was about, and this was before all the trans exclusionary radical feminist stuff that's happened lately, for which I've been very proud of J.K. Rowling. But
yeah, she's
been terrific.
Yeah.
But the point was that she was kind of this dime store progressive on Twitter. who is in many ways just farming out her characters to boring, socially liberal political agendas. But in the story, it was like, what's glorified? It was family. And I mean, the Weasleys are obviously a Catholic family that doesn't know what contraceptives are. Loyalty, tradition.
So
yeah, everything is. It's a very conservative story, and and my conclusion was just that. Well, she knows better than she thinks she knows. She's tapping into stuff that's true, and that maybe she doesn't even consciously acknowledge is true. But our hearts sing when we hear that stuff and when we read that stuff. And the same thing is true of just about any good story. In fact, one of the coolest parts about being a Christian, I mean, if I had to pick, it'd be tough. But one of the cooler parts of being a Christian is being able to unlock these stories, to look at them and go, wow, okay, I see what's going on there. To watch, my kids watch the old 1999 Disney Tarzan. Can you believe 1999 is old now? And the moment where he kills the leopard that killed his parents, and he like lifts it up, and he's just sort of taking dominion and everything. And I just said, "Wow, do you see what's happening, kids?" And they were like, "Yeah, sure, he killed the leopard." But you get that stuff, right? It unlocks it.
Yeah, it is. It's a wonderful thing, and I think it's in contrast to like this typical Christian posture of fear. Like looking at everything that in the media or whatever may be out there with like great wariness and like, it's gonna invade my soul and destroy me. And sometimes I think the pendulum can swing too far that direction, and like we don't have a spirit of fear. And so like because of the fact that the world is absorbing these stories, like sometimes you'll watch a story on TV or whatever, and I'll just be like, oh my word. The lie is so unbearable. It's just like this is the picture it's painting of the way the world works is just not true. But sometimes you see these stories, and you see this incredible, like at the heart of it, like underneath like what can appear to be some grime and kind of awfulness. You see that like the real truth they're telling is good, and so it excites me to like I think we need to hold both of those in tension. Yes, we should be careful with what we consume. At the same time, we don't have to be afraid, which is part of why, like, I love, like, the where the Wingfeather Saga sits and things. Like, with the new releases, they're in Barnes & Noble in the children's fantasy section, right next to Philip Pullman. Like, Peterson is right before Philip Pullman and The Golden Compass, which is, like, the anti-Narnia. And I'm so thrilled that like these books live on the same shelf because they're just kind of straight up fantasy novels. They just happen to have been written by this guy who knows Jesus. So
is Pullman still out there? I mean, I felt like The Golden Compass was kind of a 4.5-star book, and then they just went downhill from there in the reviews.
I read the first one of those books, and I thought it was a blast. I was reading it, and then I got to the last scene, and it was one of the most overt, like preachy things that I had ever encountered, which just kind of goes to prove that people accuse Christian stuff of being preachy. It's like, it's not just Christian stuff that's preachy, just so you know. Anyway, I know that I think there's a Amazon or HBO Max series of The Golden Compass now. So it's like it's still doing its thing. Whatever. But I guess my point is just that like people are going to consume stories. They just are. And if you look at all of the goofy streaming platforms that exist now, people are like going bonkers and watching movie after movie after movie, which is why, I think it's so important that Christians be telling true stories. Which circles us back around to the way I signed your kid's book.
Right.
See what we did there?
Right. Well, it circles around too to the question that's implicit in a lot of these things, whether it's fiction or music, is do we operate under a label? Do we call ourselves Christian musicians, Christian writers, heaven forbid, Christian creative, something like that? Should we live in a ghetto, or should we just be Christians who are writing good stories? And I recognize that you're kind of in a place of tension on that because your music comes out under a Christian label, I guess, and you're widely known as a Christian singer. You don't hide it. It's not. I mean, compared to someone like Switchfoot, you're way up there in terms of overtness, and yet you're very much stepping into this space of parody with Philip Pullman or with the general fantasy scene when it comes to Wingfeather. Where do you see the balance between explicitly labeling ourselves Christian and just trying to get out there and be mainstream?
Well, I dug into this a little bit in Adorning the Dark, the nonfiction book, kind of on the creative life as a Christian.
Yeah, we talked about that last time. Very
good. And I think for me it comes down to calling, and the fact that some people are uniquely gifted to move be Christians who are moving in the mainstream kind of media world. So a great example is Drew Holcomb and Ellie Holcomb. Like, I don't know if you listen to those guys, but they're both good friends, and Ellie is amazing, and she is one of the most joyful, positive people you'll ever meet who loves Jesus. She was a huge voice of comfort, not just to me, but to my daughter when my daughter was a junior higher and on into high school. Ellie is just amazing. And so definitely an overtly Christian artist. And then Drew, her husband, kind of moves in that like Dawes and I can't even think other artists like them. I'm blanking on all that, but just mainstream general market singer-songwriter stuff, you know?
Right.
And they're both like doing good kingdom work, right? It's amazing. Like, he's just called to do that thing. She's called to do this thing. So my thing is like I used to think that it was like bad to think of yourself as a Christian musician or a Christian artist. When I first heard people delineate between that and an artist who is a Christian or a singer who is a Christian versus a Christian singer, I was like, yeah, I'm a Christian who is a singer. I'm not a Christian singer. But then the more I thought about it, there's like a built-in kind of snootiness to that. You know, there's a little bit of like I'm cooler than just being a Christian singer. And the truth is, like, there's no wiggling around out of the fact that like Behold the Lamb of God, my Christmas album, is a Christmas album, right? It is about Jesus. Like, the title is Behold the Lamb of God, for Pete's sake. And so you
didn't even do a new version of Sleigh Ride in that. It was just all about Jesus.
Right. And so it is like undeniably Christian in content. It is Christian music, right? In the same way that like a stained glass window in a cathedral is Christian art, or the Caravaggio's work, right? And so it's like there's nothing wrong with being a Christian artist. The only time it's bad is when the art is bad. Like, being a Christian artist is great, and the church is responsible for some of the best art in the world, and it was overtly Christian. And I think that those painters would probably have thought of themselves as hired by the church and Christian artists. So anyway, I just think that it's important to kind of point out that like some people are called to do explicitly Christian stuff, and that there's no reason to be embarrassed of that. I think that's great. But I think the only problem comes when we use the Christian content as an excuse to phone it in.
Right. So it's about the quality of the art. It's not about like using Christianity as an excuse to produce subpar art, not
subpar or derivative, homogenous, non-artistic.
Exactly.
Media.
Well, that raises a question that really is on my mind continually when I read or watch or listen to really good stuff that that strikes me as beautiful and true, and yet I'm not sure where the author or the singer or the director is coming from. And that is, how do Christians improve our game? I mean, it seems like we had the best game in town for 1700 years or whatever, and then all of a sudden now we're just universally known, at least in this culture, as cheesy and corny and lame. I know you push back against that in Adorning the Dark, because you list a bunch of these people who are doing great stuff and just aren't getting attention. But so I guess what I'm asking is, number one, how do we actually produce better art? And then number two, how do we change the perception that people have about that?
Well, I mean, I think I don't know that it's our business to change people's perception. I think that we just keep doing the work. And
marketing departments everywhere just groaned.
Yeah. I'm not saying that's true. like, I think that, yes, those things are things we got to think about, but ultimately it's none of our business, like that, or at least I would say that's secondary to doing good work. That if you're focused on the long game, doing good work, and not getting rich, but leading a rich life of obedience, long obedience in the same direction, when it comes to the art that you want to make, then you can kind of like free yourself of this like need to be relevant or to matter. You're just like, I'm just like doing the work that God has given me to do, hopefully doing it in a way that is serving my community and loving my neighbor, the people closest to me. And, some people are called to kind of like do it with a larger platform or with a broader reach. And that's great too. And there's strategies like, I have marketing meetings. I'm not saying that marketing is bad, but like, but I think that if that's your main goal, then you're in trouble. Like, I think that's the thing is like, as we know, money and power and fame are alluring and destructive. And if you're not careful as a believer, when you're trying to do this work that God has called you to do, then money, fame, and power are going to corrupt and destroy you. and I think we've seen things like that happen. Just the proximity to power can be intoxicating, and so as a believer, to relinquish power, to think of yourself as a throne warden who's called to protect the weak and to care for the small and to put your own needs second. That's how you do it. I think, like when I think of poets like Gerard Manley Hopkins and George Herbert, who, as far as I know, didn't published almost nothing in their lifetime. It wasn't until after they died that their poems were discovered and published. And 400 years later now, I can read a George Herbert poem and it can move me to tears. Not because he had a marketing department.
Yeah.
Right? Not because he was interested in changing the culture. He was just being obedient with the gifts that he'd been given and faithfully tended his garden. And it's the Lord's business after that, what happens with your art. If it's
to some extent, I can see the marketing department's point, because I meet all these, guys and women as well who have this vision for, I want to write novels or whatever. I want to be an author. And they just sit cloistered in their own self-perception of genius, and they're writing their stuff, but they're not willing to actually do the stuff that, that editors and agents want you to do, which is get out there and market the heck out of this stuff and come up with blurbs and hooks and speeches and things. Think in terms of getting somebody hooked who doesn't understand your genius, that you think you have. And you even see this with Tolkien, the progression of how things went. The Hobbit became big first, The Lord of the Rings became big, and then Tolkien died. And then his son comes in and says, well, hang on, there's this great stuff that my father wrote, and it's sitting in the attic, and nobody's seen it yet. I'm going to put it together and publish it. And we get the Silmarillion and the Children of Húrin and all these great things that have come out afterwards that give the backstory of this whole thing. But I think you're crazy if you believe that Tolkien could have approached a publisher even in his time with the Silmarillion and gone, hey, publish this. They would have said, what is this? Like, we can't, there's nothing here. But because he did the marketing work, so to speak, the appealing work, then people were willing to listen to his story. And it seems like there's something kind of analogous going on in your career, where you've done this, the 3-minute work, right, of making people cry with music and just, grabbing onto them with that appeal of truth. And then there's now a sort of willingness to say, oh, this Andrew Peterson guy has written some fantasy stories. I should probably look into those because I love his music. And I just wonder how to reconcile those two things, because I can see the point on both sides, if you know what I'm saying.
Sure. Yeah. And it is tricky. Like you're lying to yourself if you can't admit the fact that when you're writing the poem or the song or the book that you want a lot of people to read it. Like you do. It's like you don't want to hide it under a bushel. It's like if I really believe that this song it tells the truth in a way that the Lord could use in someone's life, I want as many people as possible to hear it. Right. And that's part of why I signed a record deal. Like my the label that I've been with for the last decade or so. They're great people. But, a few years ago, my contract was complete. I'd made all the records I said I was going to make. And then I was like, okay, do I re-sign with them? And so I called a couple of mentors, and they were like, I said, if you were me at this point in your career, would you re-sign with a label? Considering that you can list anything on Spotify, you can make albums yourself, you can whatever. And they all said no. They were like, I would never re-sign because you can make so much more money on your own. You'd be fine. And so I was like, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then when I switched it around and I thought about it in terms of, will more ears hear these songs if I'm with a record label? If there is an entire marketing department trying to get those songs out into the world, will more people hear it? And my wife and I were like, well, obviously, yes. There may not be a drastic amount of difference, but there will be more people for sure who will hear the songs. And I was like, ooh, man, that's creepy. At what point did I start thinking about how much more money I was going to make versus how many people were going to hear the music, right? And so I re-signed with the label. I was like, okay. And who knows what I'll do next time. But at that point, it was very clear to me that, like, I'm not doing this to get rich. I'm doing this because I believe in the gospel and that these songs are a way of sharing that gospel with people. So I'm all that to say, like, yes, you want there to be a broad reach. But first, there's the hard work of, sitting in the chapter house with my guitar and wrestling a song into being and playing it for my dear friends and trying my best to communicate it and doing the hard work of playing show after show after show and refining it and shaping this thing and doing the craft work first, right? And then going, okay, now that I have this thing, Lord, what do you want me to do with it?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's marketing.
I thought writing columns was hard, and then I read Adorning the Dark, and your description of the agony of writing a song. I mean, and it really is true. I forget who said it, but it said that someone asked, why did you write such a long letter? And he said, because I didn't have time to write a shorter one.
Oh, it was Mark Twain, I think. Yeah.
It was Mark Twain. Well, he's the one he's the catch-all basket for all unattributable quotes,
Yes,
so it
yes.
just all goes to
Or
him. Either that
Chesterton.
or Chesterton or H.L. Mencken or something like
Yeah.
that. But it really is true. I mean, music is hard to write precisely because it's so concise.
Yeah.
And the lyrics have to be just right, and every punch has to land home. When you're writing a book, you get some wiggle room, some padding in there to say some other stuff. But as we get close to the end of our time here, I got a question that is probably on the minds of many of our listeners, and it's about really the value of fiction as a whole. When we're talking about Christian creativity broadly, but the Wingfeather Saga in particular, and then the value of stories. And we've rehearsed how truth can be found in all these stories, and then it can be an invitation back to the source of truth. But how would you respond, Andrew, to someone who really looked at fiction itself and said, well, why would we go to a sort of copy of the thing when we can go straight to the source as Christians and go to the true story? What's the real value of this fictional stuff that's written by men and women who are fallible and not inspired when we can just get the real thing in the inspired Word of God?
I don't even know where to begin responding to that, because that, like, is so far from my way of seeing the world. Is that the world is just burgeoning with beauty, all kinds of beauty, human made beauty, but also God made beauty, and like all of this stuff. And it doesn't always have a cost benefit ratio. There's not, it just doesn't work like that. And so, delight and entertainment are good things. It's wonderful to just enjoy something for itself without looking for, like, what spiritual edification is on the other side of it for me. Maybe I just approach things with a childlike sense of delight and enjoy it for what it is. So I'm working on a new book, finishing up a new book right now called The God of the Garden, which I don't think I've announced that title until this moment, but it should come out later this fall. But it was written in...
You heard it here first, folks.
Yeah, it was written in quarantine. I was kicked off the road basically last year. And so for the first time in my adult life, it stayed still for one solid year. Like, I've lived the last two decades or so on the road, constantly moving from place to place. And during 2020, I was here, and I love to be here. And so it's a book about, it's kind of a memoir using trees, my love of trees as a framework. And And so anyway, I was doing all this research on trees, and part of that included research on trees in the Bible. And what kind of kicked me off into it was the Bible Project's wonderful podcast series on trees called The Tree of Life. And I highly recommend it. It's fascinating. But, Tim Mackey, the guy, he says that there's no better candidate for a biblical theme than trees, because trees show up all throughout Scripture. And encounters with God and trees usually happen in the same place. And anyway, he was talking about in Genesis, in the creation account, that when God made trees, it says that he made them pleasing to the eye and good for fruit. And so I love that there's this implication that some of the trees are just there to be pretty, just there to be pleasing to the eye, just there for us to behold and delight in. And other trees are there to have fruit that we can pluck and eat, and they keep us alive. And I would argue that that's how art is. I think that some art is there to just be delightful and to entertain us and to be pleasing to the eye. And other art is there for us to very intentionally be nourished from. Does that make sense? And so I would say that, like, Scripture is certainly a work of art. And so there's a sense in which some things, like Christian music, Ellie Holcomb, Scripture, the Chosen series, things like that are like really edifying and good for us, and we do those things. Then other things, like a good Pixar movie, I would argue that a good Pixar movie is a little combination of the two, right? But other times it's like, man, I grew up loving Looney Tunes, or daffodils. Like, I'm looking at them outside my window. I keep bringing up daffodils and crocuses, and like, as a gardener, like, I can't eat a flower. They're just there because they're pleasing to the eye. And so why should why should the things that humans make be any different?
There's superfluity of beauty in God's creation. We should be superfluous with our beauty as well. Or you can even invite in Tolkien's concept of subcreatorship, where we're creations, we're emanations of God's pure imagination. We should go and do likewise. But of course, ours is always derivative, and it always points back in a way. But I guess it really comes back to the question of, what are we here for? What were we made for in the first place? Was it just to get the answers right, or was it to celebrate the answers and glorify God through beautifying truth and just being superfluous and extravagant with it? I love that. What a great answer. Well, I have to ask: is there? My kids wanted me to ask this one. Is there more coming to the animated series? Because we got the first 15 minutes of In the Dark, or Beside the Dark. What is it called?
On the Edge of the Dark Sea.
On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness. There we go. What kind of Wingfeather fan am I? And we got the first 15 minutes there, up until Lily sings the song and Jurgen shows up. But what about the rest of the series? Is there more coming?
We have, I don't know how much I can talk about it, but
okay.
Good news is on the horizon.
Very cool.
That's all I'm going to say.
Very cool. All right, that's hopeful. Yeah. We can work with that. We can sustain ourselves on that for a while.
Yes.
How about in the fiction department? Is there more potential fiction, either in this world or in some other, knocking around in your noggin?
Yeah, so on March 23rd, I think, is the release of Wingfeather Tales, which is that collection of short stories in the Wingfeather world, which is really fun, written by myself and several other authors. So there's all these little fun glimpses and Easter eggs into the Wingfeather characters in those stories. So that's coming very soon. And then I have I just signed a contract to write a standalone young adult fiction book with my son as the illustrator. And so
fantastic.
My son Aiden Peterson, he's an amazing artist and is about to graduate college with an animation degree, and he's just incredible, and has already worked as an illustrator over the years. But I've never gotten to do a project quite like this just with him. And so yeah, the wheels are turning. I'm not ready to talk yet about what the book is, but I'm excited to dip my toes into fiction. It won't be a Wingfeather book. It's just going to be its own story.
I hope it won't be a Robert Galbraith book either.
Man, I like those.
Did you?
Yeah. Have you read those?
No, I haven't. I just heard a bunch of. I just heard disappointed Harry Potter fans talking about it. That's all I've heard.
No,
Okay.
I'm kind of a sucker for a good murder mystery anyway. And
All right.
She's good. Yeah, it's the real deal.
Poirot, Agatha Christie, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I love that stuff. And she's, they're not rated G, but they're really good mysteries for sure.
Check it out. Well, folks, thanks so much for listening. My guest today has been singer-songwriter Andrew Peterson, who's also the author of the Wingfeather Saga, which is a fantasy series for children that's just come out in a new and really cool looking re-release. I'm a real nerd for cover art, and this one looks cool, so I encourage you to check it out. To do that, you can visit wingfeathersaga.com, and you can order copies there, as well as watch the first 15 minutes of that hopefully soon-to-be extended animated series based on the books that I mentioned earlier. Andrew, thanks so much for joining me today on Upstream. It was a real pleasure to have you.
Yeah, man. Thanks, Shane.
Thanks for listening to Upstream with Shane Morris. For resources and more commentary on Christianity and culture, visit colsoncenter.org. Upstream with Shane Morris is a production of the Colson Center Podcast Network.